Well, thank you for coming to the last of our Ask Gleaves seminars this year. I am sad that we're drawing this to a close. This mighty band has come back again and again for more and more, and I feel very honored that you've wanted to come and listen to some of my ramblings and musings. I was just telling Brian that I compose what I write at really odd times. It's unpredictable. And last night, this happened to form in my head, literally after I went to bed. So the title of this could have been Leaders Are Sheep. Leaders are sheep, depending on, what stage I was in my drifting off. But here's what I wanted to get across in this idea that leaders are readers. It seems to me that there are four paths by which we become leaders. We take four paths. One of them is the path of observation, and that's where we're watching what other leaders think and do. What do they say? How do they reveal what they think about leadership and what they do, actually? The second path is the path of experience. It's when we have the opportunity ourselves to become, we find ourselves in a leadership role of some sort. It could be as modest as in our family, where somebody has to step up to the plate and say, Mom and Dad, you're not being rational, or, brothers and sisters are not handling the estate well. I got to step up to the plate and be a leader. It can be in very humble circumstances that we find ourselves in leadership positions. In the classroom, group projects, it can be any number of things where we become leaders. But we accept that challenge. And that's where we start to gain experience as leaders. The third path is the path of correction. That's where we're willing to let other people say to us, you blew it. You made a mistake. And you need to be able to listen and to be apprenticed and mentored and taught by seasoned leaders, or people who just have a strong suit that maybe you don't have. Maybe you have a 10-year about something, and you need to be a little humble. Say, okay, I have something I can learn here. And then, rather than be resentful about being corrected, actually be grateful for the opportunity to have made a mistake and to grow through the mistake. That's how we become better leaders. And then the fourth way we learn and grow as leaders is by reading. And I think that if you are a reader, if you're somebody who really enjoys a good book, you're going to pick up a lot about leadership. But what I'm going to say now is a little bit counterintuitive, because I actually think that we get the most out of reading after we've gone through the other three stages. Now, this is totally opposite what most of our society tries to teach you. You go to school, you start from preschool, Head Start, in the kindergarten, you've already got your, in third grade, I actually think I'm more in the school of Plato on this. The great Greek philosopher Plato, back in the 4th century BC, 5th century BC, said that we learn the most when we have had some experience, and he recommended that we not even start our serious schooling until we're about 35 years old. 35 years old when we start really engaging in philosophical discourse and thinking about what it is we do. This is when you go, for example, for a PhD, you get a doctorate in philosophy. Even if you're a chemist or a historian or a physicist, you're getting a doctorate in philosophy. It's assumed you have to be about 35 years old before you really have the experience to have sound judgment and know what to do with what you hear. I realize I'm in a room where everybody is under 35, so I say that in a humble. It was certainly in my case. It's certainly true with me. When I go back and I look, I was very fortunate. I had a very fine undergraduate education, and I was able to be exposed to a lot of books. But I look at how I read Plato when I was 20 or 21 years old, and I devoured him then. I loved Plato then. And I knew that I was going to live the life of the mind. But I looked at how I read Plato or Aristotle or Machiavelli when I was, say, 20 or 25 or even 30 years old. And then I look at how I read them now, and it's a totally different book. It's as though I'm reading and discovering the book for the first time. And those authors have become constant companions to me. If I read the last days of Socrates say, when I was 20, we had those wonderful last 4 dialogues where Plato sets out how Socrates is accused unjustly, tried, and executed, and what goes through his mind. And that set the course of philosophy for the next 2,500 years. And I, grappled with to read what that was, as a 20-year-old, 25-year-old, and then to read it now, in middle age, it's just a very different experience. And in Socrates' case, in Plato's case, you're learning about ethical decisions that are the key to leadership. And that's something we stress here at the Howland Center. All those who say ethical, effective leadership. So the reading is fantastic, but I say that not to discourage you. I want you to read now. Don't wait till you're 35. Read now, but understand. Just take my word for it. And I know, though, there's some really smart people at the table, smarter than I am. And so I'm sure that you get more out of it as a 20, 25-year-old than I did. But wherever you're starting, you're going to get even more out of it after about age 35. It's just true. After you're 35, things settle in. Your family is kind of established then. You kind of have your routine. You really know who you are. You can answer that question. Who am I? We struggle with that question, I think, until we're about 35, 40. Who are you? Where are you going in life? I don't mean just a career. What's really your core? And once you can answer the question, who you are and where you're going, then you have an idea of how you're going to get there and why you're going there. And you can make a statement about it to others. And that statement can be with resolution, convincing. You're at a stage in your lives where you're still discovering that. And that's a beautiful thing. And in a sense, we're always discovering and rediscovering, and in a sense, even reinventing ourselves in this process. And books will be your constant companion in this process. Thoughtful people and good books. One of the things that I think is really cool about being associated with the Howland Center is that we invite in some of the best authors who are writing today. Authors who are writing about leadership and about the development of human beings. That's what we're talking about. Your development as a human being. Because it's your development as a human being and your convictions, your passions, that determine what you're going to lead and what you're going to read. And the two go hand in hand. And I was thinking a lot last night, and I was thinking about the remarks today, about having Bill Brands with us last week, and how rich his life has been as somebody who's been able to write about Benjamin Franklin and Andrew Jackson and Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt and now Ulysses Grant. And he's got all of these great observations about leadership, and he's a leader in his own right. Every semester, he walks into a classroom, and he is a leader to some 30, 35, 40 students at the University of Texas, Austin, who want to take his seminars. And they want to take his seminars because he has something to say. He has earned the right to say it. Now, Richard Weaver, the great University of Chicago historian and rhetorician, said that if you don't have anything to say, you have the moral obligation to remain quiet. And again, this is part of our recognition as we grow older and richer in our experience. We understand when we should talk and when we shouldn't. Bill Brands has filled his mind with such treasures of other lives and studied them in their depth. So they say historians, biographers are people who get to legally read other people's mail. Historians are the biggest gossips of all. Because you can be legally. It's not an ethical breach, because the person is dead and, the letters are usually made available, made public, and everyone understands that then the secrets of the life can be made public. And Bill has spent so much time, those of you who spent time with him last week know this, he has spent so much time. He does not start a biography by reading what everybody else has read. He starts a biography from having taught and tried to explain a life, the most complicated thing with which we're familiar, with all of its mysteries and its personality. He starts that biography by processing what he's thought about and then going to the letters and the written record of what this person actually said. What made them as a leader? And I mention all this as a way of just vouching for the wonderful people we've had at the Hallenstein Center. Take any of them. I made just a short list of the people that come to my mind first. H.W. Brands, Richard Norton Smith, Robert Caro, Robert Dellek, George Nash, Ron Chernow, any number of whom, whatever you think of them personally. We all have our opinions of some of them personally. I see you smile there, but you know exactly what I'm talking about. But these are people who know how to assemble the letters and experiences and the diaries, the journals, the memoirs of other people's lives and pull them together in a way that's so rich and pleasurable, it's satisfying to read. It becomes your constant companion when you're reading a great biography. You don't want the biography to end. But if you're reading the biography as a leader or as an emerging or apprentice leader, there will be so much insight for you. And I hope it's a lifelong quest on your part to read. Here's one of my favorites that I just pulled off the shelf at random. As most of you know, I gave a major talk on Churchill earlier this winter. And I think the reason I did that is that when I was a college student, I read this volume, In the Wilderness Years. And I will never forget the opening pages of this book. It is a part of me. Because, and that's, Manchester wrote the book so skillfully. There are many scenes. After you read them, they just become a part of you. And when I went back to reread it, I hadn't read it then in 30 years, since I was an undergrad. And I went back and reread it this winter. And reread those first pages that had just like a laser gone into the deepest part of my mind and lodged there. And you never know that when you're reading. You know, you're reading and you never know what the impact is going to be. But I found myself so often in subsequent work and tasks thinking about those pages. And I realized I have to do a talk about Churchill as a leader because the words stuck. And when I went back to reread it, it's like going back to an old friend. You know those friends you have where you haven't seen them for 5 or 10 years, and then you just pick right up where you left off. It's a beautiful thing. Well, William Manchester said, I highly recommend this book. He has an ability better than perhaps any of the people we've had here to paint pictures with words that are so powerful that they'll never leave you. This is just as distinct as the Matthias Sultan painting out there on the wall. It just sears in your memory. On the power of the words and biography, let me digress for just a minute. And last week on Netflix, I asked my 17-year-old son, who lives with me, senior in high school, I said, I'd like for you to watch a movie that I saw when I was in Hanover years ago, about 1990, 1989, called Black Robe. Anybody here seen Black Robe? It's about the Jesuit priests who go into the Huron, the Iroquois country. And it's an incredible movie. But there's a scene, again, I thought about it last night, but I'd like to share it with you. There's a scene where the protagonist in the movie, this Jesuit priest, is trying to explain to the Indians why they needed written language, why they needed to become readers. And the Indian chief, who was his interlocutor, you could tell was not impressed. Bah. And so this French priest says, Longface, tell me something that I don't know about you. Okay. My second wife was trampled by an elk. And so he said, Longface, follow me now But we're going to go to this other Frenchman over here. And I'm just going to show him these little squiggly lines I made. Watch what happens. And he goes over and he says, patois. Read to me what I wrote. It says, Longface's second wife was trampled by an elk. Longface listened to this, and all of a sudden he saw the magic, the genius of reading. That it gave these two Frenchmen a power to communicate. It's like reading somebody else's mind and convey the culture. We are so fortunate to have the richness of the literature we do, and to bring in the people. So leaders are readers, and I'll stop with a personal anecdote. Most of you know I spent 11 years as the chief speechwriter for Governor John Engler. And one of the things that surprised me about Governor Engler, it shouldn't have, but I just didn't know it about the man, is within the first few weeks that I worked with him, I realized he was a reader, the busiest guy in the state. A governor, has 20 state departments he's dealing with. He's dealing with a personal staff of 85 people right there. He's got a staff in Detroit. He's got a staff in Washington. He's got a staff in Germany. He's got a staff in Hong Kong. He's got a staff in South America. He's got a staff in the Middle East. He's got a staff. He is coordinating people all over. He's the busiest guy in the state. And he's got people coming in all over the place saying, Governor, you got to do this for me. Governor, you got to do that for me. And a lot of people in this town, Peter Secchia, Betsy DeVos, where I met these people because they'd come to the governor's office and they'd come hat in hand asking for some favor to be done. But what surprised me was the governor's ability, in between meetings and in those few quiet moments, he always had a book. And he would always take out the book and he would just read. Maybe it was just a paragraph. It was just a page. But all of a sudden he was making connections. This is a very similar habit that Theodore Roosevelt had. Theodore Roosevelt wrote how many books, Brian, before he was president? 20 some odd? Wrote some 20 presidents. What, a 42-year-old guy had written 20 some odd books. You know he was a reader as well by the time he becomes president. But Theodore Roosevelt was like that. He always had a book that would be open.
A book a day.
A book a day, that's right. It's not a bad habit. And the man who was, I had a second mentor in the Engler administration before Brian's heard this story. A fellow Domer, Rusty Hills, was a wonderful mentor in the Engler administration. He always had a book with him. He was always carrying Shakespeare or, just one of those little pocket books of just a play, a single play. Or, he'd have a book of poetry. Or he carried his Thucydides. He had a favorite professor at Notre Dame who taught him how to read Aristotle and Plato and Thucydides. And he always had that with him. He was always opening something randomly at a meeting. He would say, "What's Megalosuchia mean?" And, we would engage in a discussion of greatness of soul. That's what it means. What is it to have greatness of soul when you're a leader? I look back on my years in the Engler administration as the greatest graduate seminar a young guy could have had. I was surrounded by people, by leaders who were readers. And while I was a reader, because I'd been in grad school in Ann Arbor before that, boy, did I learn how rich a leader's life is who continues to read. And how rich the discussions. And they're not just talking about graphs and charts and utility, marginal utility. They're talking about things that involve greatness of soul. So as you go forward in your lives as leaders, always remember to be readers. Carry that book around you. If not in actuality, certainly in your head. That's it. On my blog, Gleaves Whitney, you can go to my most recent post from today, and you'll have a list of books on pages, these pages 2 or 3, just at the bottom. Pages 2 or 3. I have to say, I want to do a shout out to Brian here. Brian and I talk a lot about books. I brought Rusty's and John's principal to the Hallenstein Center, and he's a willing participant. We talk a lot about books in our office, and we have a lot of fun as a result. Brian lives the life of the mind as well as anybody I know. And this list of readings is in part, I think, out of conversations with him, and it's from my own background. Take a look at it. If you have a question about any of these books in here, let me know what's on your mind. There are a lot of classic works of Marcus Luttrell, Lone Survivor, how he got through Afghanistan. Vice Admiral James Bond Stockdale, whom I spoke about last time. His books in here. So I've got relatively contemporary books. The one other point, there are a lot of biographies in here because I don't like leadership books. I can't stand them. I think they're formulaic. They drive me nuts. I get bored with them really quickly. Because so often I suspect that a lot of these people haven't really been in leadership positions, have studied leaders. And that's not true of all of them, obviously. You have a great CEO, somebody who's been in the private sector, public sector, and then they write about something. But the books that tend to be more theoretical don't really interest me. I love biography. And the reason I recommend biographies on here is that those biographies will give you stories. And those stories will be in your head. They'll fill your head with what leaders have done when they've been challenged by very specific things. Where the author, like a Manchester, who can draw a skillful word picture, shows rather than just tells you how a leader's good judgment and courage was needed when a 51-49 decision had to be made and the stakes were high. Now that, telling the good story, is worth 1,000 cottage industry leadership books in my estimation. But that's just my bias. I don't want to, Brian could give you a much more balanced portrait because he both likes the biography and the leadership books. Okay, well at this point, if you don't have any questions, I would like to turn over the table, the floor and the table, to our very distinguished leadership fellow, Juliana. And Juliana, if you would like to sit at the head of the table, you may, or you can just stay there to give your report. I would prefer it if you came to the head of the table.
The camera would prefer it too.
Thanks for being here today.
Yeah, of course, thank you. And what was that word that means greatness of soul?
Megalosakia.
Okay. All right. Thanks for coming, guys. I have to admit, sitting there, I wasn't nervous this morning, but now I am. So, in last month's leadership discussion, Gleaves actually said something that really stuck with me. So if you were here, you might remember it. He said, a leader must suppress his ego in order to build trust and integrity. And this is one of those quotes you can take at face value and say, okay, suppress the ego, build some trust, be a better leader. Perfect, great. Let's move on. But it really got me thinking, what is the ego? How do I suppress it? Do I even want to suppress it? And how does suppressing it build trust and integrity? So as a former psychology student, my first thought was, okay, Freud. Now if any of you have taken Psych 101, I'm sure we all have, id, ego, and superego. So the id is a primitive part of our mind. It's unconscious and it's primarily focused on self-gratification. The superego on the other end of the spectrum is about ideals, principles, spiritual guidance. It's where our conscious is and it makes us feel guilty if we start to stray from those principles. Now the ego is right in the middle and it tries to mediate between the id and the superego. And it's responsible for functions like control, tolerance, judgment, planning. And the ego helps us to organize and make sense of the world around us. So I started to think about this, and then I started to think, well, it sounds like the ego is the only thing keeping me in check. So why would I want to suppress it? So who was right? Gleaves or Freud? Well, I felt like I needed to keep looking. So I went to the dictionary, and the dictionary said that the ego is the mind's way of separating myself from others. It defines it as the I. Okay, fine. And then I started to think about the practical use of the word ego. Like when people say, that guy has such an ego. right? Now, this is clearly a negative quality. It's not something you want to be described as having. And it's related to being pompous, full of yourself, egotistical, and thinking you're the best. My way or the highway. Okay, now we're starting to get somewhere, I thought. And so Freud says the ego interprets reality. The dictionary says the ego separates me from everyone else. And vernacular says that the ego makes me think I'm better than everyone else. So the one thing I could tell for sure from all of this is that the ego has something to do with my mind and something to do with perceptions. Okay, now I'm going to switch gears entirely just a little bit. How often during the day, and I want your input on this, how often during the day are you thinking about what happened yesterday, what's going to happen later today, future scenarios, daydreaming? What percent of your day? Yeah, well, exactly, right? I mean, really, what do you, throw out a number, what
80%.
80%?
85%.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, if we're really honest, it's a huge amount of time. It's a considerable part of our day. So, I mean, even now, you're probably thinking about, what am I going to eat for lunch? What am I going to do after I leave this room? And while that's a totally common way to live, there is another way. So, I'm going to try an experiment with you guys. And I want you to close your eyes. And I'm serious. I want you to close your eyes. Go ahead. Go ahead and close them. And I want you to say to yourself, I wonder what my next thought is going to be. Then I want you to become very alert and wait for that next thought. Be like a cat watching a mouse hole. What is going to come out of that mouse hole? And once you're very alert, as soon as a thought does enter, go ahead and open your eyes. But be very alert and wait for that next thought. Wow, excellent. Okay, go ahead and open your eyes. Some of you were doing a great job. I'm impressed. But what just happened? What did you experience?
It was a fuzzy picture.
It was a fuzzy picture? Okay. Did your mind get kind of quiet, though? No?
Not mine.
Not yours? No? Yours was moving? Okay.
Mine left.
Yours left. It left to the image. Okay.
You said a cat. So
Right, and that's instantly what you're thinking about. Did anybody experience a sense of quiet, of just being present and waiting? A couple of you? Yeah, the two people who were able to keep their eyes closed the longest. But, okay, so I want you to remember this experience as we continue, okay? During all of this trying to decode the ego started to sound like something separate from myself. Something that I could distance myself from and actually look at. So when I had that realization, my mind became very quiet, very still, peaceful. And I felt this connection to everything around me, and I was fully present in the moment. And that's what I tried to recreate with you, was that sense of being fully present and alert and aware of what's going on. And it was something that I had never experienced before. But almost instantaneously, I mean, it was a matter of seconds that I had this feeling. Thoughts started to rush back in, and I was thinking about everything else I had to do that day. But what was left was an understanding that I'm able to separate from my thoughts. I'm able to sit back and watch the thoughts that are coming in. So, now you might be thinking, great, Juliana, I can watch my thoughts. What does this have to do with leadership? Well, I'm getting there. But one more little exercise before we do. Have you ever had a conversation with somebody who's clearly thinking about other things? Yeah, we all have. And how did you feel about that interaction? Did you feel important? No. Did you want to keep sharing with that person? No. And chances are you could tell that you are not this person's priority. So, as I mentioned before, part of being a leader is the ability to build relationships full of trust and to act with integrity. But it's impossible to do either if our minds are constantly rushing and constantly spinning, and you're not in the present moment. So, now comes in that first exercise that we did. some of you, hopefully eventually all of you, were able to separate from your mind. You were able to distance yourself from your thoughts, and during the separation, you became fully conscious of the present moment. You weren't thinking about the past or the future or your long to-do list after you leave this room. You were completely in the now, as they say. And the ego can mean a lot of things, but through this, I believe it's our identification with our thoughts and our inability to be fully present. And when you're able to recognize that you're separate from your thoughts or your ego, you can begin to control it and suppress it and move into a constant state of presence. So as a leader, it's essential that we put relationships and people first. And people can sense when you are present and when you're fully engaged. By being completely in the now and not thinking about everything else that's already happened or is going to happen, you can build trust and act with integrity easily. The benefits of being fully present and living in the now reach far beyond the scope of this discussion. By suppressing the ego and learning to quiet the mind, you're able to identify with your true being and purpose. External events won't shake your sense of self, and we can save time, energy. You can be more content, feel less anxiety. The list really goes on and on. And all that we have is the present moment. Nothing else is real. And by leaving the ego behind, we can become better leaders and more in tune with ourselves and those around us. Now, I don't know if Gleaves intended to open this can of worms with his previous statement, but I certainly think he was right. A leader must learn to suppress his ego in order to build trust and integrity. Moving into a constant state of presence isn't an easy task, but I think it's certainly a journey worth embarking upon. So I hope that you continue to try and practice living in the present by watching your thoughts and taking time to look around you. And I mean, really look. Put away your iPod and your cell phone and your laptop and listen to the silence between sounds. Look at the trees. I mean, it's a beautiful day. Really look. And look at the people's faces as they walk by you. Really look at them. And you'll not only become a more effective leader by doing this, but you'll start to realize the interconnectedness of all things. And you'll experience better relationships filled with trust and integrity. Thank you. You guys have any questions or comments or...
Well, I want to say thank you for a message that too often is lost. You know, so much leadership training focuses on action and decision making, but there's this reminds me of the old transcendental meditation message from back in the 60s.
Okay.
The Beatles took it up, right, on their tour of India and all, but the metaphor that was constantly used in the 60s and 70s for this kind of thing was that of the arrow. You know, to go forward, you have to draw it back. You have to draw back, quiet, still, still point. CSO writes about it. I just thought that was a very helpful message. Thank you.
Thank you. And if you are at all interested in this, I wish I could claim, this was entirely my idea. But I have a couple books, actually, that led me down this path. And so if you're interested at all, I'd be happy to share this with you.
Where?
They are, yeah, sure. It's actually one author. His name's Eckhart Tolle. He's a spiritual leader. And his books that I really enjoyed were The Power of Now. And it's all about, the tactical knowledge of learning how to live in the present, and A New Earth. And it really teaches you about your life's purpose and how to get in touch with your being and who you really are. Very powerful books.
Can I also offer one example that comes to mind? We took the leadership fellows down before we actually had this model of our leadership academy. It was something much different. Students were writing 40-page papers and doing all kinds of things. You guys have your 40-page papers out?
No.
So we took a group of them down to Notre Dame to meet with Theodore Hesper, who was president of the University of Notre Dame for a quarter century, a little longer. He was one of the very few presidents that actually survived sort of the social upheaval in the 60s. Most presidents lost their jobs because of student uprisings, and they just couldn't handle it and ended up out. But not only did Hesper make it through the 50s, 60s, 70s, and into the 80s and 90s, But he did it with fantastic success. He's called the second founder of Notre Dame because of how much the campus changed. The endowment was 10 times larger in the end. He made it for the first time a top flight academic institution because it was more of an athletic institution before Esper. So all of these things had this enormous impact on campus. At the same time, he served 8 different U.S. presidents in different capacities. He was the first Catholic priest ever to be made a ambassador. He was the U.S. ambassador to the UN, actually, to the atomic, not the UN, the atomic, yeah, that's right. Well, I can't even name them all, but he served 8 presidents starting with, well, I'd have to go back. I've always lost track of my history here with that Esper. But Jimmy Carter looked at it once, for example, and said, what can we do for you? He said, I want to go up in whatever the fastest jet was at the time. And so they really flew the fastest jet that the Air Force had at the time. But anyways, he's a man of extraordinary accomplishments at Notre Dame and away. He's an internationally known person who has a Peace Studies Center named for him, International Studies Center named for him. And when we asked him during our visit, how did you do all of this? How did you accomplish so much with your life? Well, Civil Rights Commission. He was the first head of the Civil Rights Commission. It's called Esper Commission. But how did you do all this with your life? And he said 2 things. First of all, I'm a Catholic priest. You don't have a wife. You don't have children. He's like, and that significantly increases my time. But he said the second thing is, I had 5 meetings before this one. I have 5 meetings after this one. But I'm not even thinking about who those are with. I have no idea what's going on with the rest of my day because right now I'm here with you. And I'm here to hear what you have to say, and I'm here to share with you what you want to know. And I'll deal with that other stuff later. But it's exactly this notion that you're talking about. And that's the only way that through his whole career he was able to accomplish so much. There's so much going on, and so many leaders experience this, but he had to be able to focus on the needs of that moment throughout his career. And so it's very much sort of that mindfulness, that presence you're talking about. That's for me is a model of it.
It's a great point. I think especially while, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, that's your purpose. At that moment. I mean, it might not be your grandiose purpose, but if all we really have is right now, then what you're doing right now is your purpose. So to fully engage in it, otherwise you're going to miss it.
And I think focusing on that too, you mentioned that recently there's stress.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even if you have so much going on, but if you're constantly thinking of everything else, it's an easy way to not accomplish anything and just spend your whole day thinking of what I need to do, but just go with it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's what anxiety is, right? Anxiety is thinking about all the things you have to do or what could happen. If you're able to just be here, what's there to worry about?
Not exactly the hallmark of American life, is it? Presence in the moment.
I think at that point, though, that you're driving home, Juliana, that being really present for somebody, Theodore Roosevelt, since we've recurred to him a few times, was described as sitting, when you spoke with him in the White House, sitting stock still. I mean, he would just get a beat on you, and he was really listening intensely to what you were saying. And I think that quality of really, there are things, this might seem a little bit out there, but let me suggest this. This is kind of a little bit of an Aristotelian perspective. Sometimes we have to act like a habit is ours before the habit is instantiated.
Definitely. And
the habit then actually sends the message to the brain of how to do something, how to respond. So, for example, if I tend to be really flighty, all the time, looking around and distracted, and Christy comes in and talks to me about something, I have to be trained to just be still, make my hands still, and look her in the eye and listen to what she has to say. And then that can reinforce this presence, this present-mindedness that you're talking about. I think it's a very useful technique. Just do what your brain is trying to program you to do. Just do the action. And then your brain, now you're a good psychology major, but your brain gets more attuned to it and actually reinforces it. So, but then you'll see an improvement actually in your behavior and in your thinking.
Definitely. Even just being able to acknowledge that your mind is somewhere else. Well, as soon as you do that, you're right back into the present. So, it doesn't have to be this lofty, like, how do I do it? It's very simple, you just keep doing that and train yourself. So it's definitely accomplishable. It's definitely something you can achieve. So.
Is there somebody in your life who practices this that you not just have read about, but have actually seen it and learned from?
Not in so much that I've had a conversation with them about it, but like you were saying, when you're talking with somebody, there are those people who you'll meet, and when they look at you, it feels like they're looking, deep into your mind and your soul. Those people, it's very rare, but I think we've all met them at one point where they are looking at you. And, you hope that there's nothing, you wonder what they're seeing. But, I've had those experiences with people, and that has sort of started to inspire me to be like that. And other life experiences where, like I recently lost my job. And that was something that could have gone either way. I think a lot of people can take that very, very hard and take it personally. But if you're able to live in the present, you can accept it and act. It doesn't destroy your sense of self. And so also out of that experience, I was really able to work through this process and learn that just because something happens, it doesn't destroy your being. It doesn't destroy who you are. You're still Juliana, still, still me. And so that's kind of where I started to get into this.